They called him the supreme leader, the commander of the faithful, the guide. A cleric from a seminary city in eastern Iran who rose through the ranks of a revolution he had helped to make, held power for 36 years over one of the most consequential states in the Middle East, and died in an airstrike in his own compound at the age of 86. Tonight, we explore the biography of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. You are listening to Boring Biography, a sleep story designed for calm listening and gentle rest. Settle in, breathe slowly, and let the day fade into silence. Imagine the quiet of a seminary courtyard in the holy city of Mashhad, the low murmur of students reciting Quranic verse under the supervision of an elderly teacher, the distant crackle of a shortwave radio broadcast, a voice reading the news of a revolution unfolding in slow motion across an ancient country, the particular silence of a leader's office very late at night, the walls hung with calligraphy, the desk covered with papers, the sounds of a city outside that has known decades of upheaval. Let the story begin. Chapter 1. Mashhad and the world he was born into. Ali Khamenei. Khamenei was born on April 19, 1939 in Mashhad, the capital of the Khorasan province in northeastern Iran and one of the holiest cities in the Shia Muslim world. Mashhad contains the shrine of Imam Ali ibn Musa al-Ridha, the 8th Imam of Twelver Shia Islam, and the city has drawn pilgrims for centuries, giving it a particular religious weight in the landscape of Iranian culture. To be born in Mashhad in a clerical family in 1939 was to enter a world shaped by the intersection of deep religious tradition and acute political instability. His father, Javad Khamenei, was a cleric and Islamic scholar, an alim and mujtahid, born in Najaf, the Iraqi holy city that served as one of the great centers of Shia learning. His father's family were ethnic Azerbaijani Turks from Khamenei, near Tabriz, a detail that would occasionally surface in later discussions of Khamenei's identity and linguistic background. His mother, Khadija Mirdamadi, was an ethnic Persian from Yazd. Ali was the second of 8 children, born into a household in which religious learning was not merely a vocation, but the central organizing principle of daily life. 2 of his brothers would also become clerics. Iran in 1939 was a country under the rule of Reza Shah Pahlavi, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, who had come to power in 1925 through a military coup and had spent the subsequent years conducting a program of forced modernization and centralization that deliberately targeted the power and public role of the religious establishment. The clerics of Iran, whose institutional presence had been woven into the fabric of Iranian society for centuries, found themselves subject to restrictions on their dress, their public activities, and their educational institutions. The family into which Khamenei was born understood this tension between state power and religious authority from direct experience. His father's modest income and the financial difficulties the family experienced during Khamenei's childhood were, in part, a consequence of the reduced role the Pahlavi state had imposed on the clerical class. Khamenei's education began at the age of 4, when he began learning the Quran at a maktab, a traditional religious primary school. He progressed through the seminary system, the Hawza of Mashhad, studying under scholars including Sheikh Hashem Kazvini and Ayatollah Milani, and developing the foundations in Arabic, Islamic jurisprudence, theology, and Quranic interpretation that formed the core of a traditional clerical education. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him during this period, a diligent and intellectually serious student, though not yet in any way a prominent figure. Beyond his strictly religious studies, the young Khamenei was drawn to a broader range of intellectual and cultural interests. He read Persian literature extensively, developing a particular appreciation for classical poetry, and he maintained this literary interest throughout his life. He was also exposed through the secular intellectuals and political organizations active in Mashhad to currents of political and social thought that went beyond the traditional seminary curriculum, including ideas associated with Islamic socialism and the emerging politics of anti-colonial nationalism. This early exposure to the intersection of religious commitment and political engagement would prove formative. Chapter 2. Khameini, and the Education of a Revolutionary. In 1958, Khamenei traveled to Qom, the city in central Iran that served as the preeminent center of Shia religious learning. His journey to Qom placed him in the environment where the most significant developments in Iranian Shia political theology were taking place, and it brought him into contact with the man who would shape both his religious formation and the political trajectory of his entire life, Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini was at this point a senior cleric of considerable scholarly reputation, known for his rigorous teaching and for views on the relationship between religion and politics that were regarded by some as unconventional and by others as dangerous. Khamenei attended Khomeini's classes, and the relationship between teacher and student that developed during this period went beyond the merely academic. Khomeini's conviction that Islamic religious authority should not merely advise political rulers, but should itself exercise political power, represented a significant departure from the traditional Shia position, which had generally maintained a degree of separation between religious learning and direct governmental authority. Khamenei absorbed these ideas and was among the circle of younger clerics who became committed to Khomeini's political vision. Khamenei returned to Mashhad from Qom, but continued to travel back to study under Khomeini and to develop his connections with the network of clerics and activists who were gathering around the senior Ayatollah. During the 1960s, as the Shah's government pursued its White Revolution program of land reform, women's suffrage, and the reduction of clerical landholdings, resistance among the religious establishment intensified. Khomeini became the most prominent voice of organized opposition, and in 1964 was arrested and eventually exiled, first to Turkey and then to Najaf in Iraq, where he would remain for 14 years. Khamenei's political activities during this period led to his arrest on 6 separate occasions by SAVAK, the Shah's intelligence and security service. The precise nature of his activities during these years, the extent to which he was involved in organizing resistance cells, distributing banned literature, and maintaining communication between exiled leadership and domestic activists is not entirely clear from the available evidence. What is documented is that he was arrested, that he was interrogated, and that these experiences of detention shaped his understanding of political power and its capacity for violence in ways that remained with him. He was also exiled for a period, spending 3 years in a remote provincial town as a consequence of his activities. Between periods of detention and exile, Khamenei continued his clerical work in Mashhad, teaching, preaching, and building the network of relationships that would constitute his power base in the years ahead. He also undertook a program of translation, producing Persian versions of texts by Egyptian Islamist writers, work that brought him into contact with the broader currents of 20th century political Islam that were developing across the Muslim world. Chapter 3. Revolution and the Rise through the New Republic. The Iranian Revolution of 1978 and 1979 was, in many ways, the event for which Khamenei's entire preceding career had been a preparation. though the scale and speed of the uprising exceeded what almost any of its participants had anticipated. The combination of mass street protests, strikes, and the eventual disintegration of the Shah's military and security forces that brought down the Pahlavi monarchy in February 1979 was the product of a broad coalition of forces, ranging from secular nationalists and leftists to devout Islamists, that Khomeini managed to hold together long enough to complete the overthrow of the old regime. Khamenei was among the mainstream figures of the revolutionary movement, neither its most prominent voice nor a marginal participant. He was a trusted member of Khomeini's inner circle, a man whose loyalty to the Imam, as Khomeini was now widely addressed, and whose practical organizational skills made him useful in the chaotic early period of the new Islamic Republic. He was appointed to a series of positions in the newly established institutions of the Republic, including serving as a Deputy Minister of Defense and as Khomeini's representative to the Revolutionary Guards, the paramilitary force that was emerging as a central pillar of the new state's security architecture. In June 1981, while addressing a meeting in Tehran, Khamenei survived an assassination attempt when a bomb concealed in a tape recorder exploded near him. The blast was devastating to those around him and left Khamenei himself with permanent paralysis of his right arm, a disability he carried for the rest of his life. The attack was attributed to the Mojahedin-e-Khalq organization, an armed opposition group that had been engaged in a campaign of violence against the new Islamic Republic's leadership. Khamenei's survival of the attempt was widely noted within the revolutionary establishment, and it reinforced his standing as a committed figure who had literally borne the costs of the revolution's defense. Later the same year, in October 1981, Khamenei was elected president of Iran. He was 42 years old. His 2 terms as president, from 1981 to 1989, covered one of the most difficult periods in the Islamic Republic's history, dominated above all by the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted from September 1980 until August 1988, and resulted in an estimated 1 million casualties on both sides. Khamenei served as the political head of state throughout most of this conflict, operating under the supreme religious and political authority of Khomeini, and developing during these years the close relationship with the Revolutionary Guards that would later become a cornerstone of his own power. During his presidency, Khamenei was regarded by analysts as a relatively pragmatic figure within the revolutionary government, occupying a position broadly in the center of the internal debates that characterized the Islamic Republic's early politics. He was not among the most hardline voices on economic policy, nor was he at the liberal end of the spectrum on social and cultural questions. He was a committed supporter of the revolutionary system and of Khomeini's doctrine of Vilayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, which provided the theoretical foundation for clerical political authority. His relationship with Prime Minister Mir Hossein Mousavi during this period was characterized by significant tension over economic policy, with Khamenei favoring a more market-oriented approach and Mousavi supporting greater state intervention. Chapter 4: An Unlikely Succession. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini died on the 3rd of June 1989 after a period of illness. The succession to the position of supreme leader was, under the existing constitutional arrangements, supposed to pass to a senior Grand Ayatollah of appropriate religious standing. The designated successor, Grand Ayatollah Hossein Ali Montazeri, had been removed from consideration after making public statements critical of the government's human rights record. The field of candidates with sufficient religious seniority to qualify under the original constitutional requirements was extremely limited, and none of those who qualified commanded the political trust that the revolutionary establishment required. Khamenei was selected by the Assembly of Experts on June 4, 1989, the day after Khomeini's death. The selection represented a significant constitutional difficulty because Khamenei was not a Grand Ayatollah and did not hold the religious rank that the Constitution specified as necessary for the position. He was, in the clerical hierarchy, a mid-ranking figure, a Hojjatul Islam, rather than an Ayatollah, a distinction of considerable significance within the religious establishment. The Constitution had, just days before Khomeini's death, been revised in ways that lowered the religious qualifications formally required, a revision that later commentary suggested was made with precisely this succession scenario in mind. Several senior Grand Ayatollahs declined to recognize his elevation to the rank of Ayatollah, which was bestowed through state media and institutional declaration rather than through the traditional processes of religious scholarly recognition. Karim Sajjadpour, a policy analyst at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who produced one of the most detailed studies of Khamenei's leadership, observed that Khamenei was acutely aware of his own religious limitations at the outset of his tenure. He reportedly acknowledged that he lacked the prestige and gravitas expected of a successor to the founder of the Islamic Republic. This awareness of vulnerability in his religious credentials shaped the manner in which he proceeded to consolidate power, relying heavily on institutional control, the loyalty of the Revolutionary Guards, and the patronage networks that he built up systematically over the following decades. The early years of his tenure as supreme leader were also shaped by his relationship with the new president, Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who had been instrumental in Khamenei's elevation and who, as the more politically experienced and internationally connected figure, initially appeared likely to dominate the relationship. Over time, however, the balance shifted. Khamenei proved more adept than his early profile had suggested at navigating the complex factional politics of the Islamic Republic, and by the mid-1990s, he had established a position of genuine authority that went beyond the formal constitutional powers of the Supreme Leader's office. Chapter 5: Consolidating Control. The mechanism of Khamenei's consolidation of power over the 3.5 decades of his rule was not primarily ideological, but institutional. He exercised the constitutional authority of the Supreme Leader's office to its fullest extent, appointing loyalists to the Judiciary, to the Guardian Council, to the Expediency Discernment Council, and to the senior positions of the Revolutionary Guards. These appointments allowed him to shape the composition of the bodies that, in turn, approved candidates for elected office, reviewed legislation, and resolved disputes between branches of government. The effect, accumulated over years, was to create a system in which all effective power flowed through, or was subject to veto by, the Supreme Leader's office. The Revolutionary Guards became the most important single instrument of this consolidation. Under Khamenei's patronage, the Guards expanded from a revolutionary paramilitary force into an organization with interests spanning military operations, intelligence, construction, manufacturing, and commerce. Analysts estimated that by the 2000s, the Guards controlled a significant portion of the Iranian economy through their affiliated companies and contracting operations. This economic power translated into political power, and the Guards' institutional loyalty to Khamenei provided him with a base of support that was not dependent on electoral outcomes or clerical opinion. The relationship between Khamenei and the sequence of elected presidents who served under him was consistently one in which the Supreme Leader retained ultimate authority on the questions he regarded as fundamental, while allowing varying degrees of operational latitude on others. With Rafsanjani, the relationship was one of managed rivalry. with the reformist Mohammad Khatami, elected in 1997 on a platform of political liberalization and civil society development, the relationship was more confrontational. Khamenei used the Guardian Council and the judiciary to obstruct much of Khatami's legislative program, and the security services maintained pressure on journalists, intellectuals, and political activists associated with the reform movement. With Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, elected in 2005 and initially closely identified with the conservative establishment that Khamenei represented, the relationship eventually deteriorated as Ahmadinejad developed political ambitions and a populist base of his own that were seen as challenges to established power structures. With Hassan Rouhani, elected in 2013, Khamenei allowed negotiations with Western powers over the nuclear program that produced the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015, then withdrew support for that agreement as its political costs became clearer. With Ebrahim Raisi, elected in 2021, the relationship appeared closer and more comfortable, though Raisi died in a helicopter crash in May 2024 before his term was complete. In 1994, following the death of Grand Ayatollah Mohammad Ali Iraqi, the Society of Seminary Teachers of Qom declared Khamenei a marja, a source of emulation for Shia Muslims seeking religious guidance. Several senior Ayatollahs declined to recognize this elevation. The contested nature of his religious authority was a persistent feature of his tenure, and he compensated for it through the exercise of political power rather than through the accumulation of traditional religious prestige. Chapter 6: Repression and Dissent. The record of the Islamic Republic under Khamenei's rule includes a pattern of systematic suppression of political dissent, independent journalism, civil society activity, and cultural expression that human rights organizations documented consistently across the decades of his tenure. The mechanisms of this suppression included the judiciary, which operated under supreme leader appointment and was used to prosecute journalists, bloggers, lawyers, activists, and political figures on charges that typically involved insulting the supreme leader, acting against national security, or offenses against Islamic law. Sentences included imprisonment, flogging, and, in a significant number of cases, execution. The protests of 1999, which began among students in Tehran following the closure of a reformist newspaper and spread to universities across the country, were suppressed through a combination of security force action and the activation of hardline vigilante groups. Several students were killed. Dozens were imprisoned. The protests revealed the depth of frustration with the limitations that had been placed on the reform movement, and they set a pattern that would be repeated in different forms and with different triggers across the following decades. The most significant political crisis of Khamenei's tenure before his final years was the Green Movement of 2009, which emerged from widespread suspicion that the presidential election results had been manipulated to produce a second term for Ahmadinejad. Millions of Iranians took to the streets in what became the largest protests the country had seen since the revolution itself. The two main opposition candidates, Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, disputed the results. Khamenei sided explicitly with Ahmadinejad, declared the election result valid, and authorized the security response that killed a number of protesters and resulted in the arrest of hundreds more. Mousavi and Karoubi were subsequently placed under house arrest, where they remained for years. In September 2022, the death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman who died in the custody of the morality police after being detained for allegedly wearing her headscarf improperly, triggered a new wave of nationwide protests. The protests, which spread across all provinces and drew participants from diverse social and demographic backgrounds, were distinctive in the degree to which they were explicitly directed against the system itself, with protesters calling for the end of the Islamic Republic and burning images of Khamenei in the streets. The security response killed several hundred people during the main period of protest activity, and thousands were arrested. In late December 2025 and early January 2026, in the months before his death, Iran was again convulsed by large-scale protests. The human rights activists, news agency, a US-based organization that tracked rights abuses in Iran, recorded that more than 7,000 people were killed during weeks of protest beginning in late December 2025. Estimates from other sources place the death toll significantly higher. On January 17, 2026, Khamenei publicly acknowledged that several thousand individuals had died amid the recent protests, attributing the unrest to external enemies and accusing the United States and Israel of orchestrating the demonstrations and supplying weapons to those involved. Throughout his tenure, Iran's execution rate was among the highest in the world. Amnesty International reported that Iranian authorities executed more than 1,000 people in 2025, the highest yearly figure the organization had recorded in at least 15 years. The offenses for which executions were carried out included drug trafficking, murder, and, in a number of cases, political and security charges. The execution of protesters, including some who had been arrested as minors, drew sustained international condemnation. Chapter 7: Nuclear Program and the Economy of Sanctions. The question of Iran's nuclear program was the dominant issue in the country's international relations for the majority of Khamenei's tenure as supreme leader. Iran had been developing nuclear capabilities, including uranium enrichment, since the 1950s, under a program established with American assistance during the Shah's era. After the revolution, the program continued in secrecy, and, when its extent became clear to international inspectors and Western intelligence services in the early 2000s, became the subject of intense diplomatic and economic pressure. Khamenei issued a fatwa, a religious ruling, declaring that the production and use of nuclear weapons was forbidden under Islamic law. He maintained this position publicly throughout the nuclear dispute, arguing that Iran's nuclear activities were exclusively for civilian purposes, primarily the generation of electricity and the production of medical isotopes. Western governments and most independent analysts were skeptical of this characterization, pointing to the specific nature of Iran's enrichment activities and the concealment of program elements from international inspectors as evidence that the program had a military dimension. The diplomatic process that led to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, agreed in July 2015 between Iran and the P5+1 group of countries, represented a significant moment in Khamenei's management of the nuclear issue. Under the agreement, Iran accepted limitations on its enrichment activities and allowed enhanced international inspection in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. The negotiations were conducted by the Rouhani government, but they required Khamenei's authorization, and he gave it, while maintaining public ambiguity about his personal endorsement of the process. In 2018, the United States withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action under the Trump administration and reimposed broad economic sanctions. Iran subsequently increased its enrichment activities in response. By the early 2020s, Iran had enriched uranium to levels approaching weapons grade, a development that fundamentally altered the strategic calculus surrounding the program. The combination of the enrichment program's advancement, the regional tensions generated by Iran's proxy networks, and the internal political crisis created by the succession of large-scale protest movements defined the final period of Khamenei's rule as one of acute and compounding pressures. The economic consequences of decades of sanctions were severe. Iran's currency suffered sustained devaluation. Inflation was persistent and at times extreme. Unemployment, particularly among young people, remained high. The Revolutionary Guard's commercial empire, which operated alongside the sanctioned official economy, was an important mechanism for maintaining the economic viability of state-connected institutions, but its benefits did not reach ordinary Iranians in any comparable way. The gap between the living conditions of ordinary citizens and those connected to the system of state and military patronage was a recurring theme in the protest movements that marked Khamenei's final decade. Chapter 8: Foreign Policy and the Axis of Resistance. The foreign policy doctrine that Khamenei pursued across his tenure was an extension and development of the principles established by Khameini during the revolution. A fundamental hostility to American influence in the region, opposition to Israel, and the promotion of what Iranian officials described as the resistance to imperialism and Zionism. In practice, this translated into a strategy of building and sustaining a network of allied armed groups and political movements across the Middle East, from Lebanon to Iraq to Yemen to Gaza, that served to project Iranian influence and to create strategic depth against the country's adversaries. The most important element of this network was Hezbollah in Lebanon, an organization that Iran had helped to create in the early 1980s and that had developed over the following decades into one of the most militarily capable non-state armed actors in the world. Iran's relationship with Hezbollah involved sustained financial support, weapons transfers, and operational coordination through the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guards. The relationship between Tehran and Hezbollah's leadership was one of the defining elements of Iran's regional power. Following the Hamas attack on Israel on 7th of October 2023 and the subsequent Israeli military campaign in Gaza, the network of organizations that Iranian officials described as the Axis of Resistance came under sustained military pressure. Israel targeted Hezbollah's military infrastructure and senior leadership in Lebanon. Hamas suffered severe military losses. The Assad government in Syria, which had been an important element of the supply chain connecting Iran and Hezbollah, fell in late 2024. These developments represented a significant weakening of the regional position that Khamenei had spent decades constructing. Relations with the United States remained consistently hostile across Khamenei's tenure, punctuated by occasional periods of tactical negotiation, as during the nuclear talks, but characterized overall by deep mutual suspicion and periodic confrontation. Relations with Israel were defined entirely by hostility. Khamenei's public statements on Israel were a consistent feature of his rhetoric, ranging from denial of the Holocaust to calls for the elimination of the Israeli state. These statements were widely documented and condemned internationally. Iran's relationship with Russia grew closer over the final years of Khamenei's rule, driven partly by shared hostility to Western power and partly by pragmatic commercial and military interests. Iran supplied Russia with armed drones used in its invasion of Ukraine, a transfer that attracted international sanctions and that represented a significant step in the deepening of the bilateral relationship. Iran also maintained relations with China, which served as an important economic partner at a time when Western sanctions limited other commercial options. Chapter 9: The 12-Day War and the Final Months. The summer of 2025 brought the most direct military confrontation between Israel and Iran that had occurred during Khamenei's tenure. In June 2025, Israel launched a series of strikes against Iranian military targets, command structures, and senior security figures. The conflict, which lasted approximately 12 days before a ceasefire was negotiated, resulted in significant damage to Iran's military infrastructure and the deaths of a number of senior figures in the Revolutionary Guards and the Quds Force. Khamenei survived, but the strikes reached closer to the highest level of the Iranian leadership than any previous Israeli operation. The 12-day war accelerated Khamenei's reclusiveness. After June 2025, his public appearances became increasingly rare, and the question of his health and his physical security became subjects of intense external speculation. The security arrangements around him were reportedly strengthened significantly. Reports described the bunker at his compound in Tehran as being so deep that the elevator required more than 5 minutes to descend to the level at which he worked and slept. The CIA, according to later accounts, had been tracking his movements and security arrangements for months before the February 2026 strike. The domestic situation in Iran during this period was also at a level of crisis that had few precedents in the Islamic Republic's history. The protests that began in late December 2025 were, by the accounts of those who observed them, of exceptional scale and ferocity, and the security response was correspondingly severe. The combination of external military pressure and internal political crisis placed the Islamic Republic under strains that those within it and those observing from outside recognized as historically significant. In the weeks before his death, Khamenei made a small number of public appearances that suggested he was attempting to project an image of continued control and determination. On February 17, 2026, 11 days before his death, he was photographed at a meeting in Tehran, an image that was later widely circulated as the last authenticated photograph of him alive. The meeting with senior officials was among the last public events at which his presence was confirmed before the February 28th strikes. Chapter 10. February 28th, 2026. In the early morning hours of Saturday, February 28th, 2026, Israel and the United States launched large-scale strikes against Iran. The operation targeted military facilities, command infrastructure, and, according to subsequent accounts, the location of Khamenei himself. Strikes were carried out across 24 of Iran's 31 provinces, and the damage to military and governmental infrastructure was extensive. The compound in Tehran where Khamenei lived and worked was among the targets, and satellite imagery released in the hours after the strikes showed significant structural damage to the buildings in that area. In the immediate aftermath of the strikes, there was a period of considerable confusion about Khamenei's fate. Iranian state media initially reported that the supreme leader was unharmed. Iranian news agencies stated that he was steadfast and firm. The foreign ministry's spokesman said he was safe and sound. U.S. President Donald Trump wrote on his social media platform that Khamenei was dead. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said there were increasing signs that he had been killed. An unnamed Israeli official stated that Khamenei's body had been found and identified by intelligence sources. In the early hours of Sunday, March 1st, 2026, Iranian state television confirmed Khamenei's death. State broadcaster IRIB announced that the supreme leader of Iran had reached martyrdom, using the term the Islamic Republic reserved for those killed in defense of Islam. Fars news agency reported that he had been killed in his office within his residential compound while carrying out his duties at the time of the attack. The Iranian government announced a 40-day mourning period and 7 days of public holiday. The government also announced that Khamenei was to be buried in Mashhad, the city of his birth. The public response inside Iran was, by the accounts of journalists and social media observers able to gather information from within the country, divided. In some cities, crowds gathered in mourning. In other locations, and prominently in Tehran, crowds gathered in celebration. Images circulated of people distributing sweets in the street. The division in the public response reflected the division in Iranian society that had been visible in the succession of large-scale protest movements that had marked the final decade of Khamenei's rule. On that much, the accounts from across the political spectrum were broadly consistent. Chapter 11. What remained Khamenei was succeeded, within days of his death, by his son Mojtaba Khamenei, who was appointed supreme leader by the Assembly of Experts. The transition represented only the second succession in the supreme leader position since the Islamic Republic was established in 1979. Analysts noted that Mojtaba Khamenei lacked the public profile, the clerical credentials, and the established institutional relationships that might have made his succession straightforward, and that the circumstances of external military pressure and internal political crisis in which it occurred were the most difficult imaginable context for a leadership transition. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which had been the central instrument of Khamenei's consolidation of power and the principal guarantor of the Islamic Republic's security, remained the dominant armed force in the country. The Council on Foreign Relations noted after his death that removing the supreme leader was not equivalent to removing the regime, and that the guards represented the institutional core of the Islamic Republic, regardless of who held the position of supreme leader. Whether that assessment would prove accurate in the aftermath of the combination of external military damage and internal political crisis that surrounded his death remained, at the time of his burial, an open question. The 36 years of Khamenei's rule as supreme leader had been marked by a number of structural features that were consistent across the changes of elected presidents, the fluctuations of oil price and economic conditions, the variations in international diplomatic pressure, and the successive protest movements. The Revolutionary Guards had expanded their institutional power continuously. The judiciary had operated as an instrument of political control. The elected institutions of the Republic, the presidency and the parliament, had functioned within limits that the supreme leader's office defined and enforced. The nuclear program had advanced despite sustained international pressure and economic cost. The costs borne by ordinary Iranians across these decades were documented by human rights organizations, by economists, by journalists, and by the Iranians themselves in the succession of protest movements that expressed, at risk of severe punishment, the accumulated dissatisfactions of a society that had seen its economic conditions deteriorate, its political freedoms constrained, and its young people leave in large numbers for other countries. The Iranian diaspora, scattered across Europe, North America, and elsewhere, maintained a consistent critical commentary on the conditions in the country from which its members had departed. Khamenei produced a substantial written output across his career, including authored monographs on Islamic subjects, translations of Arabic texts into Persian, and the vast institutional corpus of speeches, messages, and lectures compiled and distributed by the Office for the Preservation and Publication of his works. His literary interests, rooted in the Persian classical tradition, were a consistent and somewhat unexpected aspect of his public identity, and he continued to comment on poetry and literature in his speeches and writings throughout his tenure. He married Mansoureh Khojaste Bagherzadeh in 1964, and they had 6 children together. He was, at the time of his death, 86 years old, and had held power for 36 years and 6 months making him the longest-serving head of state in West Asia at the time of his death, and the longest-serving Iranian leader since Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. He had survived an assassination attempt that cost him the use of his right arm. He had outlasted the leaders of every other major state in the region that had been established before his own tenure began. He had watched the network of allied organizations he had built and sustained across decades dismantled by Israeli military operations. He had governed through 8 rounds of large-scale domestic protests. He died in his office, in his compound, in Tehran, in an airstrike. And that is where we leave the story of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, a cleric's son from the shrine city of Mashhad, who studied under the man who made the revolution, survived an assassination, served as president through a devastating war, ascended unexpectedly to the highest position in a state that had only recently been invented, and held that position for longer than most of his contemporaries held any position at all. The country he governed at the end of his life was in many ways recognizably the same state he had inherited in 1989, and in many ways profoundly different from it. The questions his death opened up were, as questions of that kind tend to be, ones that could not be answered quickly. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this biography and want more stories about the people who shaped history, make sure to subscribe and join us for the next boring biography.